Okay, I'm gonna start because actually we have a lot to get through today. Um, Pastor Derek has given me a chance to keep talking to you today and a chance to actually go on to the second part of what we were discussing, which is Palestine under the colonial British mandate. So we're gonna talk about the second part, how it led up into the 1948 Nakba. And I had a whole kind of like introduction about how we can think about the Nakba in so many different ways. But I discarded that and I was like, actually, we can start by thinking about this together. So I actually wanna get your engagement here and ask you, what is the Nakba? What do you think it is? What does it actually mean? And there's no wrong answers here, because actually the Nakba is what I'm trying to say means so many things all at once. So who would like to start? What is the Nakba? I mean, you all are here probably because you know something about the Nakba, right? So give me something. Yes?
It was the expulsion of many Palestinians from their homes.
So the expulsion of how many, do you know? About 800,000 Palestinians from their home, 531 villages completely depopulated, right? And this was carried out when? How did it happen? Yeah.
It's like mostly through events like in 1947 and
1947,
1948.
specifically November 1947 until?
Until like spring 1948.
Actually until 1949.
Oh,
The war kept on going until 1949, and Palestinians kept getting displaced into late 1949. And another thing we always say about the Nakba is also that it is ongoing, right? But before that, does anybody know what the Nakba, the word, actually means? It's an Arabic word. Kira.
do you think it's a catastrophe?
Catastrophe is the most kind of like rigid translation we have. The word doesn't have an equivalent in English. But the Nakba is a catastrophe. We have a word for catastrophe in Arabic, it's Karitha. But Nakba is something way more devastating. It's catastrophe, it's disaster, it's devastation, it's trauma. It's all these things that basically make your life unlivable, right? And it carries this like emotional weight with it as well. So there's this event that we know about the Nakba, which was pre-planned by the Zionist militias, that many historians, specifically who we know as the new Israeli historians of the 1980s, were able to prove through looking into Israeli archives, right? The archives of the Zionist militias, the memoirs of the Israeli leaders at the time. So it was only after then that Western historians started to pay attention and say like, yeah, actually the Nakba happened. But of course, Palestinians have been saying that the Nakba happened for many years, and there were so many stories that people have been passing down through generations, through their children, and we carry on to this day, because memory becomes so important after the Nakba. It's our only guarantee to what? Why do you have to carry that memory? Why do all Palestinians always know where they're from, even though we're 75 years later, right now? Should have put that slide beforehand. Yes, Zach?
In order to like one day return.
Yeah, that's right. Because what are Palestinians fighting for? Up until now, up until 1948, the period we discussed, Palestinians are fighting for the right of self-determination. We're still fighting for that, but Palestinians are also fighting for something even more basic now, which is the right of return, the right to literally be on your homeland, right? And the memory, in the face of this world that denies that you were ever there, that you were kicked out, becomes so essential, right? Because the Nakba is not just the happening of the Nakba, it's also the erasure of the history. It's also your uprooting from your own land, from your own history, and the denial that you actually suffered this trauma. So imagine how compounded this trauma is with that. So what I'm trying to say is that there's so many ways to talk about the Nakba, and we can really talk for hours about it and really think about it in the present. I mean, the Nakba is not something you have to read about in the history books anymore. This is Gaza, this year, and this is 1948. The Nakba is ongoing, and you can open your social media app to see it. And people still fight for the right of return. And as we've seen, amazing pictures, amazing videos this week of Gazans returning to the north. All of these Gazans that are returning to the north, despite the rubble, despite the destruction, know where they were kicked out of in 1948 and will still fight to even go back there. So the Nakba here is holistic, is a holistic human, individual, collective experience that shapes the lives of Palestinians in every single way and shapes the politics of Palestinians. But today, I'm actually going to talk about a specific meaning of the Nakba, and that is the Nakba as a political crisis. So, what do I mean by that? For today, you've read Konstantin Zrek, who was writing the meanings of the Nakba. He was writing it in August of 1948. So, as the events were unfolding, this Damascene-born historian and leading Arab nationalist at the time tries to capture this moment in his famous text by basically coining the idea of the Nakba. The word Nakba has been circulating around in different places, but it was this book, this text, that solidifies the term. And in it, he says, the defeat of the Arabs in Palestine is no simple setback or light passing evil. It is a disaster in every sense of the word. Disaster here is Nakba, in every sense of the word, and one of the harshest of the trials and tribulations with which the Arabs have been afflicted throughout their long history, marked by numerous trials and tribulations. So you see the Nakba here, another thing is that it's not just about Palestinians. It is being perceived as a shock, a trauma to all the Arab world, right? The whole Arab world. It is a collective Arab Nakba. And he says that despite the righteousness of the Arabs' case, the potentialities of their land and the interests of other nations have in it, they have stand alone in the international arena. The great powers are hostile towards them, and world public opinion opposes them. They have no strong ally prepared to support them in such circumstances or to aid them in their struggle. So, the cause of Palestine is right. Arabs are on the right side of history, but everybody's against them. Who is specifically against them? Of course, the very powerful colonial West at the time. So, what do we do about that? And that is the question that Konstantin Zrek is trying to answer. It's not just complaining, right? This is pretty much a political treaty. It's a civilizational treaty. It's a political code. He's trying to answer, why did the Nakba happen, and how can we avoid another Nakba? And in order for that to happen, in order for us to actually fight the potentiality of another Nakba, we have to transform. And he says, only a united, progressive Arab national being would avert the Zionist danger, or for that matter, any danger which has aggressive designs on us. The first principle then is the long-range Arab struggle, and the long-range Arab struggle is the establishment of this being, which, as I have said above, will not be achieved unless there is a fundamental transformation in Arab life. Now, this is the last sentence, is very important. It follows that the external struggle to repel the dangers of aggression is linked with the internal struggle to establish a sound Arab being. In fact, the latter is the pivot of the former, and it is essential to its success. So, this reflects the political consciousness at the time. It's a kind of a moment of reckoning where, yes, intellectuals are saying, yes, we are weak in front of this colonial empire, and that's most of why we were defeated, but it's not just an external issue. It's not just the asymmetry of the war. It's not just that the enemy is so powerful. We also have internal problems. We are also disunited. Our leadership is reactionary. Our leadership is inefficient. Our leadership works for the West at the end of the day, as it is trying to say that it represents us. And therefore, we need a new revolution in the Arab world, and that text and that call actually shapes politics in the Arab world for decades after the Nakba. And we will talk about this in the section. We will talk about the Nakba generation. But for this lecture, what I'm going to try to do is to take this diagnosis of why the Nakba happened, that there are external and internal struggles that led to the Nakba, and try to apply it over the decade before the 1948 war. And in order to do so, we have to first recognize what are the sides here on the battlefield, but also over the decade, or over the decade before the Nakba. Who do we have on both sides? Who's fighting for Palestine in the 1948 war? Yeah?
Egypt.
What?
Egypt.
Okay, that's an Arab state. But before that, the Palestinians? The Palestinians are fighting for Palestine, right? Right? And the Arabs. And Palestinians have official leadership, and the Arabs have official leadership. Who is the official leadership of the Arab? We will talk about that and try to understand their problems. And we will also talk about the official leadership of the Arab, including Egypt and other Arab states. At the time, do you know how many states were involved in the 1948 war? How many Arab states were involved? 5 or 6. So we have Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. That's 5. We have 5 states. On the other side, who do we have? The Zionist movement. And, of course, its British patron. Right? And these have a relationship between them. We said they are both one, but they also have specific dynamics between them that in the last decade begin to actually become destabilized. So, but in order to really understand this war and what caused the loss of this side in the 1948 war, we have to back up 12 years back into the 1936-1939 revolt, which we already started talking about in the section. So this is a very vulgar overview. I really think that the 1936-1939 Great Palestinian Revolt deserves a whole course. And if anybody is interested in working on it in their final project, there's so much potential there. It's just a suggestion, because it's a really amazing story. At a time which was revolutionary all over the world, by the way. There was a revolution in Spain at the time. There was a revolution ongoing in China and other places. But yeah, very briefly, we talked a little bit about the context that led to the revolt. What's the context? Does anybody want to tell us? It's over there, but if you want to share what we discussed in the section. What led to the 1936 revolt? Yeah.
The dispossession of a lot of land from the peasantry.
Yeah. Zionists were expanding and acquiring more and more land. The British were giving them more grants of lands, and then Palestinians were being dispossessed of their land. And there are a lot of peasants that are going to work in the cities, and then they're going to work in the cities. We have this Hebrew labor principle where Jewish employers are not actually employing them, right? So we have a very bad economic situation, very high unemployment, and despite the sacrifices that Palestinians have made through struggle, through political diplomacy, and all these liberal means that were used, the Brits will not give up the idea of turning Palestine into a Jewish state. Migration is increasing. By 1936, we have double the amount of Zionist settlers at the time. Why are there so many Jewish settlers coming to Palestine in the 1930s? Yeah.
They're escaping the persecution.
Yeah, because of the rise of Nazi Germany, right? So that increases tension. And then there's something that sparks the whole revolt. What is the spark? Who is the spark of the 1936-1939 revolt? His name is up there. Elliot?
It's like the martyrdom of, I'm gonna butcher this, Sheikh Izz-al-Din al-Qassam.
Yes, the martyrdom of Sheikh Izz-al-Din al-Qassam. Sheikh Izz-al-Din al-Qassam comes from Syria. He is a revolutionary that's traveling all over the Arab world, and he is agitating, he is organizing underground militant groups, and they do minor operations over Palestine, and then at one point the British police is able to actually know where they are, and so they have to go on full-on confrontation. There weren't a lot that were around Qassam at the moment. Qassam basically runs and goes into basically a mountainous area next to Jenin, where they go into a guerrilla war with the Brits. The Brits come with planes, and they basically kill and martyr everybody there in Ya'bid, which is next to Jenin. The next day there is a funeral for Al-Qassam. That funeral becomes the spark for the revolution. Now, the revolution itself takes 3 years. Momentous events. Many things are happening. Everybody's participating in it. This is a mass anti-colonial movement. We're talking about peasants fighting in the countrysides. Workers go on a strike, which is the longest strike in the history of the world up until that time. A 6-month strike. We're talking about railway workers or oil refinery workers, very essential for the colonial state at the time. We're talking about women, men, religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, Bedouins, urban dwellers, peasants. Everybody is unified in this revolution. Everybody's committed to basically liberating Palestine. And that's when the kufiya becomes a thing. Does anybody know why the kufiya becomes a symbol of the Palestinian revolution at the time? Something a lot of us are wearing here all the time? Why? Yes, James.
It was a symbol of the peasants, right?
Yeah.
And they were like I don't know all the details, but they were wearing it.
Yeah.
It became like a symbol of like the peasant role in the uprising.
You're right. No, this is a good beginning. The peasants were leading the uprising, and the peasants were wearing this. This is just like regular peasant attire. It protects you from the sun, and it's just traditional wear. But why does it become the symbol of the revolution? Only because the peasants wear it? Something else happens. It tells us about the level of cooperation between Palestinians at the time. Nobody knows the story? So peasants at the time were, veiling their faces in order to go into cities and assassinate top military officials in the British Mandate, right? And so, what was the British? What was the policy of the British? Anytime you see a peasant in the city, you arrest them. You first come, you surveil them, right? So the official leadership of the revolution, what does it do? It basically commands that all Palestinians, no matter what your background is, will put the kufiya on. So the urban dwellers, people in the cities, actually wear the tarbush. Do you know the tarbush? This red thing, right? It's a symbol of kind of modernity at the time. They take off the tarbush, they put on the agal and the hatta, the kufiya, and basically everybody's wearing kufiyas, and the British can't distinguish between a peasant and a bourgeois or a worker. And therefore they can't trace the peasants. And that's how the kufiya becomes a symbol of solidarity and a symbol of revolution. We need to move on a little faster. So, but at the same time, so this is like very inspiring period, but it was also the beginning of the collapse of Palestinian society because the British go hard. The British used an iron fist. They declared a state of emergency. Counterinsurgency methods are used all over Palestine. They bring generals and troops that they have from all over the Mediterranean. They go on full war with the Palestinians and use methods of collective punishment. One example, here's a picture of Jaffa, the beautiful city of Jaffa, which was shelled. Its downtown, Old Quarter was shelled, doesn't exist anymore. This happened in 1936. 2,000 homes were blown up. And this is just one example, right? And this state of emergency basically carries on to this day, actually. Israel still does the same thing, justifies this kind of action, these kinds of actions as counterinsurgency measures. At the same time, also Zionists were being trained. I'll come back to this. Zionists actually assist the British in repressing the revolt. And the end result was that we have tens of thousands of Palestinian men that were killed, 1 in 10 adult men, according to something I read by Rashid Khaldi. And tens of thousands are in prisons, hundreds are executed and exiled. This is very burdensome for a society like the Palestinians, right? They are completely destroyed. We have home demolitions, villages destroyed. People have their working men in the prisons. A lot of people are martyred. So this is basically when the destruction of Palestinian society begins. Not 1948, right? This is when the measures of uprooting Palestinians from their homes and depriving them of their right to just express themselves politically begins. And it decimates Palestinian society. Palestinian society is so weakened. And here we begin to gauge why Palestinians lost the 1948 war. They were still recovering from this war with the British during 1936-1939 revolt. So it was the beginning of the revolution on one hand, and it was also the beginning of the Nakba. Now, that being said, the British were forced to kind of shift their policy after this revolution. Let's kind of try to remember what we said last lecture. For the first 10 years, what was the policy of the British? The policy of, what does Khalidi call it? You had it there? I heard you. No? The iron? Yeah. Cage, thank you. Yeah, I have to drag you with me. So the iron cage, this is a policy of what? Basically not giving Palestinians any legal or political venue to fulfill their national rights, right? There's no way you can organize and actually achieve your rights through the system of the British mandate. But then the Palestinians revolt. We talked about the 1929 revolt. The British mandate goes into the policy of the iron fist. It deals with Palestinians as we just described, with brute force. But then it becomes costly. So at some point begins to think about partition, right? Which is like, let me pretend to be a mediator. Of course, partition at the end of the day serves colonialism, doesn't serve the native population. And the first suggestion of partition happens in 1937. The 6-month strike I mentioned was called off so that the British could investigate, do their inquiry, and come up with a solution. It takes them months investigation. This is end of 1936. In May 1937, June 1937, news begin to leak out that they are actually thinking of partition. Partition plan is revealed. Palestinians are angry. They're protesting everywhere. And I was telling you last time, this is a picture I took of this name that was etched in the wall of a church I went to in Nazareth, an Anglican church. It says, in memory of Louis Andrews, died 26th of September 1931. You know who, 1937. You know who this guy was? He was the commissioner of the Galilee, the north of Palestine. And he was actually given the job to begin implementing the partition. Because at the time, the partition also included the transfer of Palestinians from the Galilee. They wanted to give the Galilee to the Zionists. So basically my ancestors, my people, my family would have been basically transferred. But on a bright Sunday morning, a Palestinian revolutionary sees Andrews coming out of that church, aims at him, assassinates him, and that is what we have left of that partition plan, this beautiful obituary etched in stone. And after that, the revolt comes back in full swing. And as I said, this is a very violent revolt that goes on for 2 more years until 1939. What do we have in 1939? The White Paper. And the White Paper is this compromise that the British are forced to make because this repression of the revolt is becoming very costly. Absolute commitment to Zionism is becoming very costly. And World War II is at the doorstep. So they need all their troops they're using tens of thousands of troops against peasants. They need them to fight the war. So they reach this compromise. And this compromise, nobody likes it. Now the British actually themselves are it's very controversial in the British government. The Zionists think it's an absolute betrayal. Why? Because it had limited limitations on immigration, on land sales, and promised an independent Palestinian state at some point. But the Palestinians also rejected it because it was filled with so many traps when Palestinians can't actually make any decision without the consent of the Zionists. So nobody likes this, but it's a compromise. And the Zionists were about to basically go on full rebellion against the British, but World War II breaks out. And World War II, something I can't talk a lot about, but it's an interesting period. At this time, actually, Zionists, the ones that are militarized, they are recruited into the war. They fight with the British in World War II. And Palestinians, they actually have this kind of prosperity going on. Why? Because the British could not use the sea anymore because of the war. So they basically had to install a lot of, things in Palestine that needed labor force. So Palestinians were more integrated into the economy. So it was an awkward, interesting period. But at that time, the Zionists were also making other plans. And I'm not going to go over this, but the 1943 Baltimore Conference and the 1945 Anglo-American Committee, they are important because they help us see 2 things that are going on at the time. The Zionists begin to see the decline of the British Empire. They start to appeal to whom? Their new patron, America. This is where basically the Zionists start to get Americans involved. And during and after World War II, America sees itself as the new leader of the Western imperial world, and it wants to solve the Jewish question. It's the hero of the time, even though it actually itself rejected so many Jewish immigrants, right? So that's the important process. And then we have the UN Partition Plan. The UN Partition Plan has a minority that votes for 2 states under 1 federal government, and a majority that vote for a complete partition. This is how partition looks like at the time. This happens in the 30th of November. Literally the next day, the war starts. Zionists take this as a green light to basically dispossess Palestinians and take over their homes. But let's backtrack a little bit. Zionists, how are they prepared for this war? So we already mentioned they were being recruited during the 1936-39 revolt to repress Palestinians. They were being trained by Lord Wingate at the time, who basically trains the first corps of what becomes later the IOF, the IDF. They are trained as night squads that employ these counterinsurgency methods against Palestinians. and they become a police force. So they basically are trained. They have these combat skills that they didn't have before. They have these, bomb making facility, skills. So many things that every regular army has. And then after that, they begin to form these hardline militias. We have the Irgun already in 1931 being formed. This is basically Jabotinsky's faction. We talked about Jabotinsky, revisionist Zionists, right? And they're extremists, terrorists. And then from the Irgun, the Lehi basically defect from the Irgun. So the Lehi are even more extremists from the Irgun. They think Irgun is not even extreme enough. So Irgun defects because it wants to be more extreme. And the Lehi defect from that as well, or the Sterngan as they were known. And these gangs begin to employ modes of terrorism against the British because the British are limiting migration. And we have the famous bombing of the King David Hotel, where there were many British officials, but also a lot of Palestinians that were killed. All of this, we know. The British would deal with, of course it had to deal with, but it wouldn't deal with in the same way that it dealt with Palestinians if they chose to revolt. If a Palestinian had a knife, he would go to prison, a grand life sentence. These Zionist militias weren't even disbanded, weren't even declared illegal, even after they killed British officials. And so they are armed to the teeth, very trained, very emboldened. When the 1947 partition plan is declared, they are ready to wreak havoc all over Palestine. And there's different stages in which they do that, which I can't talk about in detail, but it's important to understand that for the first part of the war, Nakba War, from November to March, this time, the Zionists were wreaking havoc, already displacing villages like Caesarea and others, and terrorizing people. They have this campaign of spreading fear and displacing people, but it wasn't until March that Plan Dalit was declared. And Plan Dalit, who knows what Plan Dalit is? Yeah.
Is that the plan to expand the borders?
Okay, can you increase your voice a little bit?
Is that the plan to expand the borders of the UN?
No. That's the plan of basically systematically displacing all Palestinian villages in what the Zionists envisage will be the Jewish state, right? And this plan was exposed by these new historians that we were talking about. It clearly shows how they were planning to do this. Why am I saying this? Why I say it clearly shows this? We know that today, everybody is clear on this. But for the most part, actually, in the West, people used to say that Palestinians chose to flee. And so when the Israeli historians were able to show Plan Dalit, they showed that actually there was a pre-German plan to kick all Palestinians out. And Plan Dalit has 13 operations. Some of them succeed, some of them don't. The first operation is called Operation Nahshon, Operation Snake. And this plan was meant to capture the corridor between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And up until that time, actually the Zionists were not successful in that. We tend to think that Zionists just displaced everybody and the Palestinians were just sitting there and waiting to be displaced. No, there was fighting, there was fierce fighting by the Palestinians. And there was serious challenge. And that serious challenge was most seen in that area around Jerusalem, in the key village of Al-Qastal. The village of Al-Qastal is this village which was next between Jerusalem and Jaffa, which was high on a hill. And the word Qastal means Castile. You know, it's basically a castle area where it's very, very fortified. And it is protected by Palestinian revolutionaries, and it falls. And once that fall happens, the Plan Dalit begins. And I want you to remember this Qastal battle. I'll return to it in a little bit because it's a very pivotal moment in that war. Just want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything before I move on. Yeah. And after Al-Qastal falls, this is April 8th, the Deir Yassin massacre happens on April 9th. Does anybody know anything about the Deir Yassin massacre? That's okay, we'll come back to it in a little bit. If you do know something about it, recollect, please. So, as I said, the Zionists were not just met with roses, they were met with resistance. So the question is, who was leading this resistance, and why were they not able to defend Palestine? Why were they not able to halt the Nakba? And so before I talk about the official leadership, it's important to mention that Palestinians were fighting as people protecting their homeland, not under leadership. A lot of them were just peasants with very, simple means, fighting with rifles, fighting whatever they have. Workers were organized and trying to protect themselves. In one of the texts that you read for this section, I hope, there is a kind of recounting of that kind of attempt to organize workers in the Galilee. But, well, also, who else? There are Arab volunteers coming from all over the Arab world to serve to basically, because they basically have the sense of duty. I need to protect my homeland. I need to protect the Arab world. I need to protect my brothers and sisters, right? A lot of these come from ideological convictions, nationalists, Islamists, communists, come to Palestine. A lot of these volunteers are actually prevented from coming. By whom? By the Arab states. But I'll come back to this in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the official leadership of the Palestinians at the time, the official leadership that failed to protect Palestine. This is where now we're in the realm of the internal elements that led to the Nakba. So who do we have? We have the Arab Higher Committee led by Mufti Hajj Amir al-Hassani. We talked about Mufti a little bit last time, right? And if you remember, we said that he was appointed by the British to lead this newly invented thing, the Supreme Higher Council. You remember this? Yes? Yeah? Well, in 1936, when the revolt broke out, he was very hesitant at first, but after seeing that all Palestinians were unified in this revolt, he basically hijacks the revolt, becomes its leader, and leads what was created at the time, the Arab Higher Committee. I mean, for him, it doesn't matter. Muslim Higher Committee, Arab Higher Committee, as long as I'm in charge. He's fine with that. And he does a lot of things that should be criticized. Well, first, during the revolt, he was very authoritarian, killed off and assassinated many of his rivals, basically used the chaos that was going on to kill his rivals and his competitors. Killed off and marginalized progressive voices, labor union leaders. So progressive voices were weakened and they could not basically take a lead in the 1948 war because of him. And he makes it into a top-down organization, even though the revolt, as we mentioned, came from the peasants. It was local and regional committees that were leading the revolt. So it makes it a lot more authoritarian. And he starts just making, even after the revolt, he just starts making his own decisions unilaterally without asking anybody of their opinion. Do you know the most horrible thing he did in 1944? Netanyahu loves talking about this. Some people know the Mufti only for that thing. No? Yeah?
Did he have a meeting with Hitler?
He had a meeting with Hitler. He bet on the Nazis. He did. It was terrible. He's an idiot. He bet on the impending victory of the Axis powers. And this was in the guise of being anti-colonial, because these familial feudal clerics, they don't care if you're colonized or not, as long as your colonizer gives you your authority over your people. That's my analysis, my opinion. But that basically, marginalizes progressive voices, but also just, alienates all Palestinians. It's like, what the hell are you doing? You are risking all of our sacrifices for these, out-of-pocket moves that are just destroying us. And so people no longer have faith in their political leadership, at least. I'm saying political because the heroes for Palestinians were not these political clerical leaders. They were the people on the ground, fighting on the ground. Enter Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, another Husseini. There's a lot of Husseinis. They're a big, important dynasty that basically has all this revolutionary legitimacy. And he leads Jaysh al-Jihad al-Muqaddas, Army of the Holy War. A little bit about Abdul Qadir al-Husseini. He is the son of Musa Qasim al-Husseini. Who remembers who Musa Qasim al-Husseini is from last lecture? Talked a lot about him. This one, I'm just gonna go quiet until somebody responds. Kind of thirsty. Yeah.
The Arab Executive.
Can you increase your voice?
The Arab Executive Committee.
Yeah. What is the Arab Executive Committee that he was leading? Somebody else can answer too. Help Helen out. He's the leader of the Arab Executive Committee. What is the Arab Executive Committee? You got this. Okay, at least I got you guys to look at your notes. I'll respond. It was basically the national political body for Palestinians for the first 20 years. Musa Qasim al-Husseini was a pasha. He had the highest status during the Ottoman Empire. Once the British colonized Palestine, he is delegated by the Palestine Arab Council to lead the Arab Executive Committee and basically fight for the rights of Palestinians. But the methods that he uses are, very liberal. They were more about appealing to the British against the Zionists, right? But then his son is different. Now his son is born in 1910, and he sees Palestine being conquered, and he sees his dad, who by now is a 70-year-old man, fighting against the British with no avail. Nothing is actually happening. Goes to study in Beirut, American University of Beirut, for a few years, and then goes to Cairo, because he wants to be in Cairo, because that's where the center of the Arab nationalist revolution is. And he graduates in 1933, goes on the podium. This is in the American University of Beirut. Rips his diploma off and says, I don't care about your diplomas, you're a colonial university. I'm here to get knowledge from, my colleagues. I got the knowledge, you are a colonial university, and that becomes so controversial. The university, the state, everybody's angry. He actually gets thrown out of Egypt. He's like, whatever, I want to go to Palestine anyway. Goes to Palestine, and there, he actually works for the British state for a little bit to kind of like reveal the internal secrets, and then begins forming underground militias which participate in the 1936 revolution. So he leads fighting around Jerusalem. And then he is shot, goes to the hospital, the British want to arrest him. He is smuggled out of Palestine for 10 years until 1947. At the end of 1947, he comes back to lead Jaysh al-Jihad al-Muqaddas with 5,000 soldiers with him. And actually, for the first few months, he is very successful. So he's leading the district of Jerusalem, and the resistance was organized according to different districts. And the district of Jerusalem was under his leadership, and he is able to cut the supply lines of the Zionists. He's able to cut the Zionist settlements from each other, actually besiege some Zionist settlements and get compromises. So very successful. Palestinians have some hope. They might win this. Until the Battle of Al-Qastam, which we just mentioned in April. Because he was the one that was leading those militias. He was on the top of that hill, the Battle of Al-Qastam. And he realizes we need arms. We need more guns. The Zionists are way more well armed than we are. So he goes to Damascus to get artillery, guns that are equivalent to what the Zionists have. As he's there, the Zionists begin this plan we discussed. Plan Nakhshun, snake, which was about to go through different strongholds of the Palestinian resistance between Jaffa and Jerusalem, beginning with Al-Qastam. They are able to take over Al-Qastam. Abdul Qadir al-Husseini comes back from Damascus and with actually no arms, fights a fearsome battle over that hill, goes on for days, and is able to smuggle himself in and fight the soldiers inside, killing many of them until he is martyred. And that martyrdom, the killing of Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, destroys the morale of Palestinians. He's the most competent leader that is killed. In his funeral, people are crying. Because in his funeral, this is the next day, April 9th, something else happens as well, the Deir Yassin massacre. And the Deir Yassin massacre, there were about 50 to 100 documented massacres. I'm not talking about the undocumented massacres that happened across Palestine. And the Deir Yassin massacre is the most famous because it was horrifying. Deir Yassin was peaceful, it didn't resist. The Zionists went in, killed women, children, everybody, used rape as a weapon of war. And people were really scared by it. We're talking about, conservative society. For this society, it's like, your land being taken away, or you're like, sisters and mothers being assaulted like that. The land doesn't matter as much. And the Zionists knew this, and that's why they did it. And I'm not going to describe the gruesome things that happened. It's very hard for me to describe, and there's so much, and I can never really do justice to it. But I'm saying that because the Deir Yassin massacre's echoes were so strong that it made many Palestinians flee to escape for their lives because they didn't want to meet the same fate. And Deir Yassin happens again and again and again. And it happens today. There's thousands of Deir Yassins happening in Gaza. But the question is, okay, so why did Abdul Qadir al-Husseini lose this battle of Al-Qastam? Why do you think he lost it? I kind of mentioned it a little bit. Yes, Jonathan?
Unable to get arms from Syria.
He didn't get arms from Syria. Why didn't he? Why didn't they give him arms from Syria? Why was he unsuccessful at doing that?
Maybe like Syrian leaders?
Syrian leaders?
Blocking that?
Okay, you're close. Arab leaders in general. And this is where we have to talk about the big betrayal of the Arab League. And you see this letter actually written by Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, before he goes back to Jerusalem from Damascus, writes this letter to the Arab League before he dies, which says, I hold you responsible for abandoning my soldiers at the height of their victory without support or weapons. He basically blames the Arab states, the leaders of the Arab League, for the loss of Palestine, and goes to fight until martyrdom. Right? And it's important to mention, though, that, as I said before, Arabs, they want to protect Palestine. Arabs around Palestine, they're like, whatever, I fight with this arm or that arm, I actually want to protect Palestine. But the leaders, a lot of them, they have other interests. They start getting involved actually in 1937. they were the ones that pressured the Palestinians to hold the strike, which I mentioned. So that's where they started getting involved. In 1945, they're like, oh, we're gonna do our Arab League to pretend we're as strong, as unified as, you know, the League of Nations. It's a joke. And in October, they formed the Military Committee for the Defense of Palestine, which had no strategy, no principles. And then they create Jaysh al-Inqaz al-Arabi, the Arab Salvation Army or Arab Rescue Army. Sometimes in English it's translated as the Arab Liberation Army, I don't know why. But it's funny because a lot of Palestinians, you know, what they call them mockingly is Jaysh al-Riqad al-Arabi, the Arab Runaway Army. Because they fled and didn't fight in the most important battles. They also weren't that good disciplined, weren't well coordinated, they didn't work with Jaysh al-Inqaz. They had many problems. But that was, you know, from January until May 15, they were the ones that were involved. They really failed in most of their missions. They were supposed to cooperate with local Palestinians. And many times they abandoned them. There are stories about them that are horrifying. Some Palestinians say if they didn't get involved, we may have actually had a chance. So that's until May 15. What happens after May 15? What happens on May 15? We discussed the partition plan. The partition plan basically gave Britain until May 15 to get out of Palestine. May 15 was the day that the British would withdraw. You want to say something? Okay. So May 15 was the day that the British would withdraw. And that was the day when it wasn't the Arab Salvation Army, it was the Arab states that got involved. The 5 Arab states that we mentioned before. And these states, you know, they're going through a lot of stuff at that time. Some of them are colonized, some of them are in the process of being decolonized. They're very weak, they're very defensive at this moment. But I want to talk just about one side, because it's the only one that matters, which is the Jordanian state with the Arab Legion. The Arab Legion was actually the most formidable and the only kind of really trained army that could have done anything. Is the Jordanian army led by King Abdullah. And, well, two things that are quite ridiculous about this. One is that the Arab Legion is trained, funded, and essentially commanded by the British. It's not even in the total control of the Arabs. Most of the generals there are British. So who are they going to save? Why would they care? The second thing is that King of Jordan himself, King Abdullah, had already made secret deals with the Zionists in 1937, confirmed in 1947 that if a partition were to take place, he would basically have a part of that cake. So when we talk about not giving Palestinians arms, it's because King Abdullah doesn't want to see an independent Palestinian state. He wants to expand his influence, his territorial control under British patronage and acceptance of the establishment of the State of Israel. And you can see that by the fact that the armies, when they entered, they only entered to fight up until the partition plan lines. They would never go further than that. What's funny is they even failed at that, though. They couldn't even protect their own their own just expansionist interests. Because as we know, Israel was able to expand even beyond the 1947 partition plan, occupying 78% of Palestine. And then in 1949, we have this series of armistice agreements with Jordan, with Egypt, with Lebanon, with Syria, and Israel was very smart about it. It didn't do one agreement. It did different agreements. These are basically the agreements that made created the official borders of Israel, which is to say Israel does not have official borders. These are all armistice lines. These are all ceasefire lines. They're not even real borders, but they become ad hoc, de facto. They are the borders of Israel. And all these resolutions, all these ceasefire agreements, they happen without any concessions from Israel, without any guaranteeing of rights to the Palestinians, specifically the right of return, the right to return to their homeland. Palestinians are spread out across the Arab world, stateless refugees. I went really fast here. Questions so far? Have any questions? Okay, I'm gonna go back and ask if you have any questions after I finish one more slide, and I'll only let you go if you have questions. Okay, that's the agreement that we're gonna do. So this is, my attempt at the diagnosis that we were trying to make of kind of the external and internal struggles that led to the Nakba. Of course, there's a lot of things that are left unsaid, but what this could help us think about is, again, this moment where Palestinians and Arabs are in awe, they're shocked about the fact that all of this could happen and nobody was able to do anything about it. It was horrifying. And they were witnessing the complete destruction of their society, the complete destruction of the infrastructure for life in Palestine. And they started basically laying blame on who? Well, mainly on the Arab states, but also on local traditional leadership of the Palestinians. So a realization takes hold that this leadership on the local and the regional level must go. It is corrupt, ineffective, and incapable of confronting a Nakba. Arab intellectuals like Constantine Drake see this basically as a breaking point. This arrangement that we have with Arab kings patronized by the British protecting our rights, it doesn't work. This doesn't work. This needs to go. It needs to be replaced by something else. And Zurek's call is actually to the Arab elite. Would anybody like to read this quote up there on the right? Yeah.
This elite must, as a prerequisite of its existence, organize and unify itself into well-knit parties and organizations. These must stand on a unified and pure doctrine and must be bound by a strong and sound loyalty to which the elite will subjugate all its divergent tendencies and in which it will willingly and freely believe. An air of national life, united and progressive, which, as we have said, contains within itself the fundamental solution of the Palestinian problem, and in fact of the Arab problem in its entirety, will remain a dream and a potentiality if it is not first realized in the souls of the nation's struggling elite, led by true leaders drawn from it, and in the system which this elite sets up, and in the parties and institutions which it establishes.
Thank you. So, you see the school, what he's writing here, is not just like an intellectual in an ivory tower just criticizing leadership. Constantine Zreg had he had a known legacy and an unknown legacy. A known legacy, he was a professor, thinker, and intellectual, was influencing a lot of people at the time. His secret legacy, he was leading the secret Arab society in the Arab University, American University of Beirut, which was also militarily active and involved itself in the revolt of 1936, and involved itself also in revolutions in Iraq and other places. So when he's writing, this is a political manifesto. This is a political manifesto that will influence Palestinians and Arabs all over. And they see this as an opportunity as well, because, well, the Nakba, well, it is a crisis. Every crisis isn't just a point of tragedy. It could also be a moment of awakening, a moment of revitalization, a moment basically that could become, with the right people in place, a new beginning. And they heed this call. Many people heed this call to basically organize a unified, well-knit party organizations. Well-knit party organizations, as opposed to what? These familial dynasties that exist, and we just accept that they, run our affairs and make decisions for us. That has to go. So students of Constantine's Rik, like George Habash, formed the Harakat al-Qawmiyun al-Arab, the Arab nationalist movement, which we'll talk about a lot later. But also, the Nakba creates a situation for revolution all around the Arab world, beginning with a very influential coup led by Abdel Nasser. See, Jamal Abdel Nasser, was actually one of the troops that fought in 1948. And he was able to witness firsthand the complicity, inadequacy, inefficiency of the Egyptian military. People literally had guns that just blew up in their face. People had to rent cars to go inside. It was really embarrassing. And that motivated a lot of people to follow his cause, which was very much Zureika's cause. He was this leader that was going to, in his mind, move the Arab world into a more progressive trajectory, modernize the economy, and move towards his dream of pan-Arab secular nationalism. And so we have a whole new situations that Palestinians are not very familiar with. They are stateless, they are refugees. We have the 1952 free officer coup led by Jamal Abdel Nasser, which reshapes the region. And we have the Cold War. All of this means that Palestinians are fighting under new conditions, and they need to fight with new forms. And that's where we have the trinity of basically communism, nationalism, and Islamism dominating the scene. But we'll talk about this in the section and in the latter lectures. Thank you. Any questions? I will not let you go unless we have 2 questions. Yes, Alifa.
Can you tell us more about the formation of the Arab League, like the history behind that?
No, I can't. I don't know enough. That's a good question, though. The formation of the Arab League, I'm going to think about it. I'm going to research it more, understand why it happened, and probably. But do you have? Why are you asking the question? Are you curious about something specific, or?
I'm just curious.
Okay. I think it's just World War II. After that, there was the United Nations. A lot of states are beginning to form their own kind of coalitions. But I'll see if there's anything interesting there and let you know. Okay? All right. Okay. James and Esme.
So I'm curious about the title Army of the Holy War. Like,
Yeah.
do they conceive of themselves as nationalists or as like part of international religion, or what was their, I guess, ideology or
Yeah.
motivation, or why did they call themselves that?
I think the biggest problem is that they weren't ideological. Yeah. But I think it was a combination of both. There was a sentiment of Arab nationalism, but this sentiment of Arab nationalism was not completely divorced from the understanding of the Muslim Ummah. And the idea of jihad is very much alive in the mind of Muslims, especially when they're fighting off colonialism, right? And this goes back to the Crusades. So it is one of the commandments to fight off oppression, and jihad is an Islamic term in that sense. And since this is led by the Husseinis, who are a feudal clerical family, this of course does have Islamic meanings, but doesn't necessarily only include Muslims. Because even the Arab Higher Committee, led by the Mufti, had a lot of Christians and non-Muslims in it. So it's kind of like a hybrid. That make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, all right. So,
I was just wondering, like, if you know anything more about the, like, deal that Jordan made with, like, Zionist leaders?
the deal, yeah.
Like, how did that come about? Like,
Yeah, that's a good question. I know only that it happened, that King Jordan made secret plans in 1937. In 1947, he had secret meetings with Golda Meir, actually, to get those guarantees. They've only read about it through the writings of other Palestinians. But that's a good question, and I promise to look it up a little bit more and give you a more clear, clarifying answer, okay? Okay, anything else? Okay, you're free to go. See most of you in 30 minutes.